I thought maybe we would dare to pick up a little bit with, or I will key off of the remarks right before the break about the struggles in working through issues between industry and universities. And it stems from the different missions of the two organizations, of course. There are obviously many examples of successful partnerships, and so it can be done. There are examples where people have thrown up their hands and walked away and said it's not worth it, and so we'd like to reduce the number of those. I'll give just a couple of examples or possible solutions for consideration when you're finding yourselves in these discussions. One is the University Industry Demonstration Partnership, which is a spin-off from the Government University Industry Research Roundtable of the National Academies, has undertaken a project they call Turbo Negotiator, and it's supposed to, I think it was conceived as being sort of like a TurboTax that you could fill in a few blanks and crank out a license agreement and people would sign it and you'd be done. It's turned out to be a harder project than they envisioned, and so it's obviously more challenging even among sort of experts who want to solve the problem. But you might look at the UIDP website. I think there may be information about that. It's open to any stakeholder, frankly, so if it's something that you're interested in participating in, I'm sure they'd love to have you. At the last UIDP meeting, there was a presentation by, I think his name is Dr. Nessel. He was provost at the University of Maryland. He's now at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And he implemented at Rochester a option B for sponsored research agreements with industry. They could negotiate, I told someone about this over lunch, but I'll repeat it. They can negotiate sort of the traditional agreement during setting up a sponsored research agreement, whereby terms and conditions and provisions for negotiating licenses should some intellectual property be developed, et cetera, all sort of pre-negotiated. Or they can go with option B, which is company gives the university $16,000 for the ownership rights to the intellectual property, any intellectual property that's developed under the statement of work. It's a relatively fixed duration. I think they do them for 1 year, maybe 2 years. They generally cover part of a faculty person's summer time or something and one graduate student of that 16, and then they're done. Go ahead and go off and do the research. The company owns the IP. The university got compensated, $16,000. The $16,000, half of it goes to the university, $4,000 goes to the graduate student, and $4,000 goes to the faculty member in their pocket, and you proceed. And it's all of the parties have to agree that that's what they want to do. It's not compulsory, so it's an interesting model, and I think some other schools are looking at some similar approaches. So again, those of you who are in the academic world could consider proposing something like that to your institution's office. So I'll just leave that out there and see if there's not some discussion along these lines or others.
So let me give you another example, which just came up among people I know. There's a project I know about that has a fair bit of industrial funding, and the company and the university worked out their IP agreement, which is about the fruits of the project. Okay. Now, meanwhile, one of the students who's working on the project had a summer internship at another company that's in an overlapping business. Okay, and he worked with some IP from that company that would be really helpful for the project. Okay. Now, the company he worked with would be fine with working with the university, but is worried about sharing that IP with the company that's funding the project. Okay, and here's the poor PI, here's the poor student. Okay, and it's totally outside what they think they're doing, and the conventional mechanisms that deal with the IP that's the outcome of the research don't apply here.
And that's a great reason for why the SRC model is one that more people should think about implementing, because it's consortial. And so we have an IP agreement which essentially we impose on all of our university partners. Once we've gotten past it the first time, we're good to go. Essentially, we fund the research, the university owns the IP, our members get a non-exclusive license. And that's the way it is. And universities have managed to make that work. Now, if there are other companies who aren't members of SRC, it can probably, a similar situation can arise. But that's sort of our basic model, and it's been successful for a long time. And I don't mean to hijack this and make it an IP discussion. There are many issues that we brought up in the panel. The use of large amounts of data, privacy issues, ethics, all of these are ones that were raised during the remarks, and I'd love to hear your comments. Stu.
Stuart Feldman. One topic that did not pop up explicitly, to my surprise, actually in either panel, was the dominance of the mobile platform, replacing most people's view of what the internet is, what data access is, what privacy is. And I'd be interested in comments, given that we're supposed to look at the 5-year timescale plus.
Yeah, I did hear that
yes, this
music videos and the way they're filmed has been impacted by the fact that everybody's watching them on a screen that big.
So yes, it doesn't get rid of the need for the terabit pipes to support all this, but I'd be interested in comments about the shifts that will imply on many of the other issues.
But there is some of that is a privacy issue, and I was. My view was I'd simply punt to the next panel for that.
Yeah.
Good answer.
Yep. Thanks.
Mike, maybe?
Yeah, I also, in talking about this interesting combination of people, systems, and data, I was assuming that large parts of the system were going to be mobile, but most of some of the big hairy problems we have to address here don't really matter whether it's mobile or not. The more interesting question is, how simple can the devices be? And I think we're going to talk about that tomorrow in the Beyond Virtual panel. When you take 100 billion devices, each one 5 cents or 50 cents, you have some really interesting questions and some new challenges. But your point's very well taken. It's obvious that we need to be thinking of the mobile side of this.
Maria.
One of the points that Mike made was when we think about the places, particularly in this, whatever the bumper sticker for Emergent Cognition will end up being, when we think of the challenges there, Mike made the point that, the biggest place we really need to pay attention are the people, the users that are going to be using this. And one of the issues that I think comes up in many computer science departments, certainly not all, is that the people that do that work, the human-computer interaction work, which is very interdisciplinary, it involves skill sets that most computer scientists don't have, and is often viewed by computer scientists as not real computer science. And I wondered if you would like to comment on what we could do to change this issue.
I'll start the answer, I guess, even though I'm not an expert in this area. When I was at the Navy, they had some research in this area, and it was because, and I actually had a chance to go out to sea on a Navy ship for a week, and it was quite illuminating. And one of the things I learned is they select for people to sit in a room watching multiple screens with headphones on with 2 different acoustic signals coming in, and they can still have a conversation with you on a separate topic. So this ability, there's a lot going on in that environment, and the Defense Department is very interested in pilots and how they get information and still fly a plane at the same time, or in the battlefield where you've got a lot of different information from different directions and different distances that you need to manage. And so there are government needs, and one sort of point that I guess I didn't include, although I meant to, was the idea that the government is a user. There are obviously sort of Joe Sixpack or whatever as a user. There are, as Myron said, industry users. There are, healthcare companies that don't want to themselves develop the technology, but they need it and they use it. Monitoring, environmental companies, all sorts of businesses could benefit and have needs that the IT supplier companies or you as the research community may or may not be aware of. And so, again, getting that dialogue, getting that information, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you do all know what those needs are, but I think to drive just this kind of research, there needs to be communication. And I don't know if one of the other panel members wants to comment.
Let me just say, first of all, I do think human-computer interaction is a critical discipline that we need to study. But I fear I'm sounding like a broken record. Industry has understood this for a while. The concept of this is real research or not real research probably doesn't permeate the industrial research areas, and certainly not the development groups, nearly to the extent that it does academia. And so we've broken down that barrier, just as we've to some extent broken down the interdisciplinary barrier inside of at least most of the industrial research centers I've seen. And so again, that's another incentive for solving the business of getting academia to and industrial research and industry, perhaps in more general terms, as you suggested, to interact. Because I think it will point out that there are important unsolved, unaddressed problems. And despite Maria's complaint earlier, I think if you have an important unsolved, unexamined area, that's a good place for a graduate student to do work.
I also wanted to comment in the context of cyber-physical systems that I mentioned, just the paradigm, the assistive. There are faculty involved in this who have actually gotten also NIH funding as they use these personal communication devices for alerts. And the idea that the usage of such PDAs and other mobile devices is a type of data stream that's included in the fusion of the other data streams. So how you model it, how you assign a security level to it, how much information leakage you allow, whether it's an emergent situation, in which case the security situation gets lower priority. These are very, very good research issues. So I have not found this attitude, so to speak, or that it may not be research.
If I can just pile on and broaden the question a little bit, I like Mark. I see a lot of people in industry who are very excited about human-computer interfaces and spend a lot of money and a lot of time on them. And so it doesn't seem to me that the people with the dollars think this is some sideshow. But I think there's a broader question. There's a lot of other topics beyond HCI. The question of how do wired systems of individuals work together, what motivates people to use Facebook. These are sociology problems, and I certainly think those are problems where the computer scientists say, well, that's not real computer science, that's not even science. And yet, they're fundamental issues we've got to solve. Well, really, really important. I also think with HCI, we've had some hero stories over the last 10 years, and that's helped a little bit. Trey Hawkins and the design of the Palm, that was a wonderful story about how technology can be made to be more approachable. Can I ask a question of the audience?
Yes, you may.
Okay. I was talking to Jane Margolis over the break, and we got into this question of complexity and how do you make the technology easier for Joe Sixpack. And I wanted to do a survey of the people in this room. A lot of the people in this room are very technologically adept to have all sorts of technological toys. How many people in the room have spent at least an hour in the last month dealing with some thorny tech problem? Laptop hygiene, VCRs that don't work, software upgrade that didn't. Okay, so 1 hour. Okay, how about 2 hours in the last month? How about 5 hours? Okay, in the last month. Well, last week. Okay. Do I hear 2? Do I hear 10? How about 10 hours in the last month? Okay. Okay. So I hear at least. This is pretty impressive. I mean, this is a group that probably does understand the technology a lot better, and yet we're spending 10 hours a week at least, or 10 hours a month at least, trying to get the stuff to work for us. We clearly haven't gotten it. We've got to work on better systems that are more that are more versatile, understand what we want, take care of themselves rather than requiring our hand-holding.
So you should ask yourself how many people in this room gave their stuff to someone else who's
Did you hear the question? How many people gave up and gave it to somebody else to fix? That's really impressive.
True.
And if we did this question to the full group of people watching on the webcast, we'd actually have some real data we could use.
Mark, did you want to comment before we? And then,
Mike, I think you brought up an interesting question, which is, I think we've tended to think in a positive way. Here are the research problems we could solve, and here are the good positive effects. When I thought about your bumper sticker example, I think I have a good way, perhaps it's not a bumper sticker, but a good way of communicating the importance of making correct decisions from data. And maybe this is a touchy subject, but we recently had this thing called a financial meltdown. And it's fundamentally because a bunch of people came up with a computer model based on which they made decisions. The computer model, in some deep way, did not understand the difference between statistically dependent and statistically independent variables, because they assumed that foreclosure rates was a constant term and it would be continued essentially forever. And they also assumed, the local direction of the housing market would continue because that's what their data looked over. They didn't ask, can all housing prices go down simultaneously, right? Statistics 101. You should know whether or not your data your variables are dependent or independent. And I think that this is a topic which we can really understand. We need to make decisions in this country based on good analysis of data. It looks like I opened up a can of worms here.
Actually,
Myron, and then we'll come over here.
So
You'll be next.
my reaction to this, and we can talk later, it's not statistics 101, it's common sense 101. And you learn very quickly that people believe what they want to believe rather than what statistics tells them. So I think the problem is in another space. I want to go back to the co-op and make an observation and then bring up two possible ideas to this forum. Is that one of the things that I see in again, I will talk about computer science, is that people want to go through the program as fast as possible, even today. So anything that slows you down, including becoming an assistant professor at the age of 27, is considered that you are doing something wrong. And whether you want to go out with a bachelor degree and to get a job, or whether you want to get a master, where for a lot of the students that we train means a green card, you want to get out as quickly as possible. So I think that, again, going back to the culture, we have to find a way to slow things down. I personally believe that not having postdocs in computer science is bad. And when compare ourselves to other disciplines, there is a whole phase that we are missing in our training, in the way that we are working. And if we get postdocs, all they do is they want to publish yet another 15 or 20 papers, rather than working in a lab and understanding it. So two observations. One is, if we compare ourselves to NIH-funded disciplines, we don't have the notion of training programs. And maybe it is time to consider having training funding to our field and to see how we apply it. And maybe one way to apply it is not only to have a co-op with industry, but have co-op with other disciplines. Go out there as an undergrad and spend a year doing the information technology needs of a biology lab or a physics lab or whatever it is, and try to understand how it looks from the other side, going back to Michael's point of think as a user when you don't know what to do. So I think these are opportunities that, if they are being supported and funded, can help us to change the culture. And we don't have to go only to industry in order to see real users with real data, with real problems.
I'm just going to comment, and then I'm going back here where we had a point, and then we'll come up here. And that is to echo what we heard before, which is the co-ops who graduate often are the best students, whether it's because they did a co-op or whether it's because the program selects for that is competitive or whatever. So I think a student who looks at the results and especially if it helps to defer or defray costs might decide that it's worth it. Up back here.
Eric Matala, Sparta. If you look at what actually occurred in the recent financial meltdown, I think statistics played a minor role, but I think what happened is one might conjecture that a few rocket scientists were hired by the financial services community to create, to apply mathematics from control systems without recognizing in the context of analyzing data coming in from the real world applied to those models, that there are three things that could happen. One is you have a trajectory that you're trying to hit, and you start from ground zero and you come up and you hit it, and you grow consistently over a long period of time. This is fine. Alternatively, number two, you come up, you overshoot it, okay, but you come back and you maintain stability, a stable control system. What's the third choice? Anybody that's gone through control theory knows what it is. You start bifurcating and you move back and forth beyond, and with each swing, you start swinging more wildly. I contend that what we're actually looking at is Emergent Cognition 101, because the system that we have developed through the advances of computing in the last 20 years, and the fact that everything is interconnected, is we are observing a manifestation of unintended consequences because everything is working together, and we don't understand the implications of how they are working together from a control systems perspective. But that's the world we have.
Well, I think science is cumulative, and so maybe the technology has a chance. Human behavior, we don't seem to actually learn from past mistakes.
Cynthia McIntyre from the council.
Can you use the mic?
Picking up on Eric's point, perhaps because NSF has a social science research component to it, perhaps there's an opportunity for NITRD to incentivize research on just this problem of coupled dependencies in the financial market to the economic.
Well, certainly there's the program component area on social SEW, workforce. Yes, I don't want to just use acronyms. Thanks. Maria.
I just want to make a really important observation about training programs, Miran. What we see in the areas like biology and chemistry that have significant postdoc programs before you enter academia is that we lose a very large percentage of the female PhDs in those fields who never go on to academic positions because those training programs go right through the fertility age for women, and so they do one postdoc or they do half a postdoc or 1.5 and they drop out. So I would hate to see computer science. Computer science happens to have an amazing statistic that the percentage of assistant professors that are female that are hired is slightly higher than the percentage of female PhDs, and that's been true for at least the last decade. So we're very good at our pipeline may be very small, but in fact it happens to grow in terms of the percentage of women. And one of the reasons is because we don't have postdocs.
Let's do.
Two unrelated comments, if I may. One,
can you use the mic?
Yes, sorry. Stuart Feldman. One on co-ops and such. Let me just put in a loud industrial vote in favor. I'm responsible for a couple offices in Canada, and one of their absolute standard ways of snaring people, very good ones, is indeed the multi-phase co-op. And the only difficulty is they don't show up in the summer, so it's a budgeting problem. We finally starting to learn that there's more than one quarter in the year. You get it wrong for a couple times. In the U.S., we actually have, in essence, separate pipelines for people who have had internships and people who have not, and very different hiring probabilities.
Good to know. So there's
because
data.
once if you know them from a year's work, a summer's work, or whatever, you have every reason to have a pretty firm decision, and it's much easier than coming in random.
Sure, it helps both sides decide if this is a good fit.
Utterly supportive of all forms of this. It really works.
Some students decide, hey, this is not for me, and that's the best thing to find out early on. Yes. Did you have another comment?
It's impossible to not comment on the Meltdown thing, to point out that in addition to the statistical assumptions were the fact that by setting up whatever formulas were set up, it provided the great opportunity to game the system by the use of the asymmetric probabilities, and that is very much a human system, not just a computational one. Misaligned incentives always work.
Hold on just a sec. Did any of the panelists want to comment on?
I just wanted to follow up on Maria's comment. I don't agree with you because, first of all, I don't know how much statistics we have in computer science, because I think being a postdoc as a female, it actually is very easy on you because you gain publications while you can also have a family, you have flexible time. Right now, I have a postdoc for 2 years, a woman whose husband is in California, and she's with me and has a small child. And she's building her resume like crazy. So given the, also aside from female versus male, given also the financial situation now where most universities have frozen their positions, that's another reason where there should be more active, effort by NITRD to create, I was talking about this to Chris yesterday, to create an interdisciplinary pool of postdoc funding where different people can apply to. And finally, the reason is that if at least in computer science we're going to reach out into interdisciplinary domains, it is very important to have a postdoc program where I could get, for example, an experienced chemist or an experienced material science person to build nanosensors and things like that.
Could I just respond to that?
Sure. Then we'll come here.
So first of all, I would have no problem if every postdoc supervisor were like you. The issue is because, the issue is the question of whether the advisor is going to be supportive of somebody who's going to have children or is going to expect them to basically be a slave in the lab. And so I think the problem is if everyone were like you, I would say absolutely. But there's lots of data that shows that this is a huge issue in biology, physics, chemistry, et cetera, in terms of.
I think especially in the life sciences. Mark?
So I think that there are a variety of different kinds of internships. Somebody earlier mentioned undergraduate co-op programs. I have no idea what the statistics are. Somebody can probably find out. Do people who have an undergraduate co-op get through their PhD at a younger age or a older age? It could be either way from what I could guess. If they've got a good industrial experience, I think that the co-ops the interns that we've taken have tended to be early in their graduate career, and they might lose 3 months out of because they may be doing something different from what their PhD topic is, except they usually don't know what their PhD topic is then. And so I think that in those cases, we probably don't slow people down very much at all. And then, of course, not all PhDs go to academia and have to get on the tenure track. I think that IBM has fairly generous.
IBM is a great place to have children.
You're right. So,
I had my children.
So maybe you should come to IBM, have your children, then go out and get tenure.
I suspect that more co-ops. Hold on. I suspect that more co-ops are done by people who are maybe planning to go into industry anyhow, and not so much people who are tracking towards a PhD and academic. Oh, okay. Well, there are some.
So, I think it's really better to look at the
Canadian model.
It's better to look at the Canadian program because it is so widespread, and it's something that is just done as a natural part of being an undergraduate. And I think that the maximum difference it makes in terms of your time to get a PhD is 1 year, because it takes you 1 year longer to do your undergraduate degree, and that's it.
Susan. Sorry. Let me get this gentleman here.
Pano Sansaklis from the University of Notre Dame. I just wanted to return the discussion to a theme that came up a couple of times during the presentation of the panel, from data to decision. I think the problem is more complicated than we think it is, because certainly we'll have a human looking at the data and making decisions, so visualization and all the other issues are very important. But I don't think this is going to be the only way to operate in the future. It's going to be a combination where the computer system not only identifies, acts upon the environment, and also you have the human. We already have this system. So when you drive your car with the ABS, the anti-lock brake system, the human makes a decision to step on the brake, but everything else is done automatically. So we better know what we are doing, because the system, when it interacts with the environment, can really harm anybody who's around if it's not designed properly.
That's a good example. Hold on, Susan, and then we'll come up here.
I want to return to the intern co-op discussion, because I think we started mixing a lot of different issues and different agendas there. I wanted to remind people that MIT has had a co-op program for a very long time. It's been very successful. It's an undergraduate program. The motive, a lot of the people, a lot of the best students go into it, but then they go into industry. They're, many of them, not the future PhD students. So the purpose is different. The purpose of Marone's proposal, which I really like, is not quite, it doesn't have quite the same motive. There it's to broaden your experience and your education. The purpose of the intern program is primarily to enlarge the research capabilities of graduate students. And then the postdoc, for me, is the most problematic. So let me give you a scary statistic. In the biological sciences, the average age at which an NIH investigator gets his or her first grant is 38 or 39.
I think it's over 40.
Now over 40, okay? That's a consequence. There are a lot of factors, but this longer and longer apprenticeship is part of what has caused that outcome, that there are people who get more and more training. They actually get better and better as researchers. There are fewer jobs. There are fewer academic positions. So you hold them in the apprenticeship longer, and here they are, and talk about women dropping out. Lots and lots of women drop out, although lots and lots of women are trained in the biomedical sciences.
Now, the doubling of NIH, sorry, did you want to?
Well, I just think we have to be careful not to mix up too many different agendas and to be clear on what our motives are for the different programs we're proposing.
Well, my understanding is that the increasing number of postdocs that people do in the life sciences is in part an outcome of the doubling and then flatlining of the NIH budget. So I just mention that because we're in the process of ostensibly doubling the NSF budget for physical science research. And I hope we learned something. One of the reasons why under the American Competitiveness Initiative or the Innovation Agenda or whatever we're calling it now, that it is over 10 years is to be able to manage this process. Then, of course, the stimulus package come along and we give NSF a 50% boost in 1 year. It's like giving a diabetic a candy bar, I'm afraid. And I hope that the after effects, I hope that NSF is thinking about how to manage this sort of shock that it's receiving, and I think it is, and the other agencies as well. But I just wanted to sort of make that point because I think there are strategies for NITRD and all of the programs as we look forward to hopefully growing budgets that need to be treated carefully. Yes.
Just one comment to respond to the postdocs. I don't assume we go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in a second. And I think it would be interesting to have a discussion. You know, I didn't think about the gender issue here, and we can argue whether, you know, is it easier to have children when you're an assistant professor trying to survive or a postdoc? And I think it is subject to discussion. I'm not saying also that we should take what NIH does exactly the way they do it, but I still feel that going out there just after a PhD at the age of 27 and becoming an assistant professor responsible to get your career award and all the kind of things and tenure is ticking against you, I think it has downsides that we have to look at them and have a discussion. What is the right solution? Probably we are not the right one to decide on it, but at least have the discussion.
Bryant, you've been waiting, and then Julia.
So I'm back on the different thread, on the thread that Panos was on, but it's related to the panel because I was hoping somebody in the panel would deal with the issue of collective emergent cognition. So what Panos described was a system in which there was only one human decision maker, and what we're going to see is we're going to start to see systems in which there are multiple decision makers, and that seems to me qualitatively more difficult than the situation that he described. So I'd like the panel to.
Well, this is Philia Macedon. I'm not sure I understand the total definition of collective, if you mean in terms of humans only, because in such environments, you can also have decisions made automatically by sensors, devices, etc.
So that's what I mean, both humans and devices in the same system.
Okay, well, the fact that you're collecting this information from previous patterns, from the previous actors, also helps in decision-making when you have more than one human actor. So there are issues, though, computational issues of noise and so forth in terms of capturing the activities of different humans or different, that's a computational issue, a data modeling issue.
So I was talking more about the emergent behavior. You have multiple decision makers who have to be coordinated in some way, but you're in a system where there are new behaviors that could be emerging dynamically.
But you have a pool of strategies already in place that can guide this multiple decision-making process.
So that's the question. You have a model in which the control is a pool of strategies, but the strategies may be things that are being evolved in the system as well, right?
I mean, I think healthcare decisions may be in this category.
So I have a very easy punt on this. What we're talking about is it worth investigating technology that would bring us from data to making good decisions? And what you're saying is, shouldn't we consider collections of people and the combination of people and machine intelligence? And the answer is, of course. And do we know how to do that? Not really. And so I think you're right. This is a fruitful area of research. But you did touch on a topic which I'm very fond of and which didn't kind of count in the emerging technology, which is I think we can use the notions of computational thinking to help debug organizations independent of whether those are interacting with computers. And I think that there's a lot of interesting work we can do, and we've been starting to do that in the context of program development and organizations that do program development. But I think that that's a fascinating area and probably one that's worth an enormous impact on the GDP and has not been paid much attention to. Let me get back, though, to Sue's comment on internship. You're right, there are different agendas. The one I mentioned this morning is, we've got the stimulus package. At the same time, a lot of internship possibilities in industry are probably, shall we say, less than they had been. And so the capability, the ability of people to take those summer internships will probably diminish across the industry unless government can do something. And I think that it's a very valuable thing for the world. Whether we do postdocs or not, I don't have a strong opinion. I do believe that we do need to come up with mechanisms for industry and academia to work together, and this kind of internship at some level is, I think, a good thing.
I'm going to say Mike first and then Philia.
I want to just pick up on where Brian left off and to say that we do have these incredible opportunities if we can understand how organizations develop intelligence to start tackling these opportunities in public safety, in healthcare, as was mentioned, e-government. I'm teaching a class on e-government 2.0, whatever that is. But one thing everyone agrees is this idea that millions of people, by expressing their preferences, can come together to consensus, create a political solution that may never have been possible without the technology we have that allows them to pool their ideas and bounce ideas off each other and refine those ideas. So I think we've got a great opportunity. Maria, about an hour ago, asked the question, how do we get people to treat these fuzzy science questions as real science? This is a very flippant answer to that question, but one way is to come up with a new buzzword. And I think what IBM's been doing with service science is very, very powerful. Computer science wasn't a buzzword until about 40 or 50 years ago when people realized there were a bunch of different disciplines that had to come together to enable people to program computers. Now we've got to learn how to program systems of people and computers. And service science was intended to do that. We haven't quite figured out what is in service science and what isn't. The curriculum is just developing. But there's nothing as much fun for a new professor as a new field. Getting on the ground floor. And so there is probably a place for NITR to input into that discussion about what is service science, how can we create this new discipline, how can we bring together economics, management, IT, and psychology, and make it all work together.
Philia, and then...
Yes, I totally, I'm going back to the postdoc. Since my first PhD was in biophysics, and that was BB, before babies. And I realized when I was working for this very demanding professor at the University of Chicago that I would be his slave forever before I would be able to get an academic position. Starting to have babies, I realized that this is my opportunity to go into another field. Now, I'm not suggesting all biology and chemistry and so forth postdocs go into computer science. It was much easier to get a job. What I am asking really is Susan, who has some data, is why can't there be a program again, an interdisciplinary program to pool such postdocs who may be locked there until the age over 40, where they could be, whoever wants, morphed and trained into computer science that so desperately needs domain expertise. And by the same token, computer scientists who are too fresh and too young to go and undertake, building a lab, applying for a career, et cetera, also do something similar with another field.
It's a double major solution we talked about earlier for undergraduates. Same thing.
Over here.
I'd like to go back to one of Michael's bumper stickers, think like a non-user, and suggest that there are some near-field opportunities in the general area of emergent cognition for thinking with non-users. In looking at advanced IT and scientific progress enabling discovery, there are two somewhat separate problems. One is essentially the scientific thinking, the computational thinking, the innovation of ideas, the testing of hypotheses, and another is understanding the arcane set of parameter switches that go with WRF, MOM-POP, or any of these other legacy codes. And I think in the area of emergent cognition, thinking about virtual organizations particularly, there are in the short run real opportunities to engage sociologists as researchers and guides, engage the traditional NITRD community, and engage the discipline scientists, domain scientists who are not using the advanced tools, but could if they were enabled to do so by participating in a virtual organization, as opposed to being told, congratulations, take 2 years off from your grant continuity to learn computational programming, and you can go back and be more productive. So I think there are some real opportunities to look at emergent cognition writ small, perhaps, in science, and make some really important changes in a small number of years.
Agree strongly.
Seems to meet with resounding agreement, I guess. Panos.
Again, just to reinforce.
Can you grab that mic?
Thank you, Panos Ansaklis. The fact that one has to look from the non-user point of view. Look, when you drive a car, you are not required to know what's going on in the engine to drive a car. And so as computers become as part of every day, embedded everywhere, the humans probably will take the higher level decision. They won't need to know all these computer languages going in. Okay, so I completely agree with you.
I think there needs to be a sort of caution about, and I'm preaching to the choir on this, I'm sure. There's room for certainly blue sky research that's not driven by a predefined need. We don't know, otherwise we would never have new anything if it was all sort of driving towards something that we already conceived. So I'll put that on the record. You have a comment here.
We'll see if it works. Charles Palmer, IBM Dartmouth. One of the things that we struggle with, or at least my department...
Charles, get closer to the mic.
Or raise your voice.
That could be a little
Bring the mic
difficult. One of the challenges we had back at Watson with my teams there is everybody wanted these co-ops, everybody wanted the interns. And then they would all show up. And then they realized, despite how many times we warned them and reminded them, then they show up and they realize, oh, gee, we actually have to work with these people. And it's not a criticism of the team. Everybody has their topics. Everybody wants to do stuff. But when you bring in interns, particularly if you bring in undergrads, they require a little more hand-holding. And so while this is a wonderful idea, and I want to do more, we have to realize that there's two parts to this. Someone's got to help pay to get them there, and then someone's got to make sure that once they're there, there's someone to play with.
I think a well-managed program, educates the mentor and the mentoree, or whatever you call the person who's doing the mentoring. We've all been in that experience. Are we running out of gas? We have about till 4:15. Is that right?
I have a question, actually. Maybe a naive question. So it's so frustrating for me as chair of a department to make industry support interns and co-ops. And I want to ask, does industry gets government funding, right? I mean, to some extent,
well,
for certain programs. Or there could be additional government funding where there is a matching. I mean, that's a naive question, where it's not so difficult to arrange for internships and co-ops.
I mean, one can imagine if maybe this is a NIST thing because it has sort of a commerce aspect to it. I don't know if NIST has had in the past or whether it has now these kinds of programs, but I think that there is certainly the possibility of that. I don't think it's prohibited. I don't think industry, by definition, gets government funding. Today you can't assume that about all companies. Certainly, Mark.
Just as a point of data, IBM has some government grants. For example, we've got some DARPA funding for a variety of projects, and that will pay for internships for those projects. However, most of IBM research, never mind the rest of IBM, is not funded by government grants, and there it costs us. And as Charles said, there are two costs. There's the cost that we pay to the intern, which is substantial, and there's the cost we pay in staff time to supervise the intern, which is also very substantial. I mean, we really strive to give our students a good experience and to think through carefully an assignment that they can actually complete in 2 months and has research content, which is a bit of a trick. So there are two costs, and as I said, I think that a lot of industry will be cutting back this year on exactly those programs.
I understand that, but if you were given funding, would you
I believe
be
that if we were given
receptive.
funding this year, we would increase the size of our program.
Given funding for
Yes.
not in general.
Yes, I believe that
Susan,
this
and
year.
then we'll go down the row.
I have a question for the panel. In one of the roles of NITRD is to coordinate among, as we heard this morning, 13 government agencies. And I'm listening to this discussion, and we're talking about industry and what sounds to me like NSF. And so I wonder if you could comment on the topic of emergent cognition and how it relates to the mission agencies.
I'll start with that. I think a lot of the people in the room are from universities and receive NSF funding, so we're going to have somewhat of a bias in the examples we bring up. But as I look around the agencies, I see huge opportunities at DARPA, in the intelligence agencies, to use the technologies we're talking about and to help fund the development. They have some unique needs. Stu mentioned the shift towards the mobile devices. The military is entirely mobile, and more so. They're going to be leading in the development of sensor nets. Understanding all the data that's coming in from those sensor nets is going to be critical. So I think there are agencies that should be funding development. There are even more agencies that are going to take up some of the tools we develop and put them to use in some very innovative ways. NASA is already doing some cool things with crowdsourcing of data analysis. They're doing some very interesting things with systems design that I think play into this. So I do think this is a cross-cutting initiative. It's probably, in some ways, it's probably the most, well, I guess the beyond virtual is also going to be very multi-agency.
But my question is, that's another form of interdisciplinarity. And I haven't heard any good ideas about how the cross-fertilization between the missions and the academic programs and the educational programs and so on are going to take place in this space.
Well, I'll follow up on Mike's comments, and I think having run some interagency activities myself, it's always a challenge because the mission of the individual agency is first and foremost in the minds of the managers that are participating even at the interagency. I mean, you're touching a big agency with one person at a meeting that takes place once a month if you're lucky. And so you have one sort of advocate in that agency through the person who's coming to interagency discussions. And I think that NITRD should really spend a lot of effort on this very activity because one of the main reasons that the government invests in research is to address its own needs. So I can think of examples at CDC following disease outbreaks and tracking it. That would be an emergent cognition application. I can think of at the PTO, which is swamped and has a huge backlog of patents that they're trying to evaluate and examine. You know, couldn't they somehow benefit from easier access to the incredible amounts of information that they are trying hard and they're making some innovations, and maybe they're already, these things are happening. But I think your point is a very good one. And if, you know, I only see the list of the funded agencies, I guess, of NITRD, but I'm surprised, especially given this morning's topic, that the Department of Education wasn't in the room. Seems like they certainly should be. And you can kind of go down the list and think of many others. So we did hear from Chris this morning that hundreds of people from different agencies have been part of it. So I have a feeling that the participating agencies, or whatever they're referred to, are there, and hopefully they are engaged.
So let me mention that we have done some work that would easily fit under the emergent cognition banner. I don't want to be more precise than I have been, but it has been of interest to agencies other than NSF, significant interest to agencies other than NSF. On the other hand, I don't think I could describe that in a free and open environment that would be appropriate for the kinds of discussions that NSF has. So the rules of the different agencies and the goals of the different agencies may in fact occasionally make that harder. But emergent cognition is absolutely of interest to groups other than NSF. I think that what we've been able to do is, in the context of the work we've done in that context, we've been able to publish papers and we don't say who it's of interest to. And so it does get into, the ideas do get into academia. I want to be very careful about exactly what I say here, for obvious reasons.
Over here. I know, and I have a couple down here. We're coming back over there.
I guess just to shift focus a little bit, I guess one of the issues that listening to the discussion is a concern for me is that all these are great ideas and so forth, and with NITRD being a group of multiple agencies working together, the question I have is, how do we make sure that it's not just a coordination issue? For example, each agency is going to listen to these discussions and say, okay, I need to have a strategy now for emergent whatever, or this. So you not only get some duplication of effort, which is to be expected, but coordination is enough. I'm wondering if we need to look at some sort of strategy which begins to say, look, agency A is going to take maybe this piece and will be dependent upon other agencies and find a way to leverage work being done, not just through coordination.
There may be examples of that in NITRD. There certainly were in the nanotech area. Health and safety research fell to multiple agencies, and it takes a lot of work to do that. But it's important to do it because, and there are many topics where you have jurisdiction that does cross. Food safety is in Department of Agriculture and FDA, for example. And so the agencies do have a history of working together where they butt up against each other's missions.
Yeah, but it's more than just working together. I'm saying its strategy is that we will find a way to leverage each other, not just, because mission agencies are fairly strong with where they're going and they're fairly independent. So, I mean, I'm trying to say if there's another cross-cutting strategy which encourages that sort of coordination and cooperation.
Yes and no, I think. Congress gives an agency money to do its mission. And so when they start, they just have to be sure that they are making the case for the fact that they are doing the work that's important to them and not doing somebody else's job in a sense. But that argument can be made, and OMB is very receptive to it, in fact, and they love it when the agencies leverage and mesh together. So it certainly can happen. Down here we had a couple of comments.
We had, getting back to some of the comments that Philia had talked about earlier about the challenges associated with bringing bridging the gap with interns coming into industrial concerns, and it gets back to what you were just addressing, Mark. And the fact is, a lot of the research that we do is classified, all right, by virtue of the funding agencies that are actually seeking to do that. And what we have realized at Sparta is life is what it is, and we have gone upstream and we've established working relationships and now have actually successfully brought on students as interns where we contact them about 6 months before they arrive and initiate the clearance process. We bring them in. Once we claim them to be an employee, when we pay a small stipend, we can now trigger the security clearance process. They come in, they serve their internship during the summer, right? And in some cases, 2 cases, we've actually gone to the extreme where we have brought in foreign national doctoral students. We have nurtured them through their PhD programs. They have graduated, and they have now become American citizens, and in both cases, they now have TS clearances. So the fact of the matter is that if you, some industrial concerns are so concerned about the lack of available talent to do the tasks, the work that we do, that you come up with very innovative ways to circumvent that challenge. So talk to me in that regard.
Some of the work we do is fairly classified, but the vast majority is not. I just realized that there's another emergent cognition thing that we do, which I talked about, the question answering system, which we are getting funding from some agency. I don't happen to remember what. Well, but it's not NSF.
I could give you a name of a project that we just recently completed, but that's all I can say about it. But the title of the project is Situation-Aware Protocols and Edge Networks.
Right. But we do we do have stuff where that kind of thing is not an issue. In research, in IBM research, we have relatively few people with security clearances. So almost by definition, we don't do a lot of that stuff.
In our case,
yeah, you probably have a very different issue.
We've got a very different profile.
Yeah.
Barbara, did you have?
I think I'm going to save it for tomorrow.
Okay. Over here, Gene.
So I originally only had one, but I'll just add to that. As somebody who does work in the classified environment, part of why agencies bring me in is to look at problems and abstract out more general problems that can be brought out into the external arena. And they're constantly looking for good people from academia who have enough understanding of what that boundary is to bring them in. So there are opportunities there, but they have to be managed carefully. And we're seeing more openness in some of the intel agencies in particular because they have such a desperate need for talent. But the point that I really wanted to make is maybe one of the places to focus emergent cognition and some of the other things that we've talked about is back on the profession itself. And what I mean by this is we lose sight sometimes about the pace of change in our environment. If you talk to historians, a human generation is considered to be 34 years. We go back half a human generation, 17 years. There was no commercial use of the internet allowed. None. The World Wide Web, the protocol had been developed, but it didn't exist. Digital Equipment Corporation was the second largest computing company in the world. Microsoft was a largely failed software company that had not yet come out with Windows 95. Half a human generation. Look at where we are now. Google, of course, didn't exist. Most of the other things that we're talking about. That isn't very long, and for many of us, we lived through that. Now think about the students that you're talking about educating with internships or with other things. We want to give them the ability to have a lifelong career, to be able to go out and learn and to earn a living and to make an impact on society. And their life cycle for jobs is going to be potentially 30 to 40 years. So how do we convey to them the skills and the knowledge and give them the tools to be able to work in an environment that is as much changed in 17 years from now as the change that we made from 17 years ago? And I don't know that we're going to be able to do that unless we actually use some of our own skills and knowledge management and assistive devices and other things back into the profession itself. And so I suggest that as a potential challenge for some of the work that we're going to be doing.
And that also points to some of the lifelong learning elements of education, which we didn't discuss much this morning. Oh, sure. Here we go.
Okay. I have another question. In terms of NITRD, is there, Chris, that's for you. It is not clear to me as an academic about the different federal agencies. If there is a table, sort of a grade of commitment to providing funds for education, and at which level, in your efforts to coordinate and motivate, more collaboration and so forth, is there like a scale, some kind of comprehensive assessment of past and current record in supporting education?
Yeah, actually, I would deflect that question out to Susie Iacono, who's co-chair of the SCW program. Back in September, we held a...
Yeah, here.
Share the microphone. Chris Greer from NCO, and I was just going to pass the question to Susie Iacono to provide some information about the workshop we had on some of the educational activities of the NITRD agencies back in September and some of the insights that arose from that. Can you comment on that?
We formed a interagency group that's looking at network and IT education. And so this is an interesting group because education is certainly part of NITRD, but there's also a subcommittee on education, right, that is similar to this subcommittee. Their entire focus is on education, not networking and IT education. So we're trying to pull their knowledge together with what we know to build a part of the strategic plan. So this is an ongoing effort. We're having continuing meetings, and I think that it's a very exciting part of what we're doing here.
Mike?
I had a question taking off of the last bullet on my slide about what Joe's user needs. We didn't really discuss this much, but one of the things that Joe user wants is veracity of information. He wants to have some way to validate, understand that the information that these IT systems are giving him or her is actually right, current, usable. It seems we're going the wrong direction in that regard. Most of the assessments I've seen indicate that we're not building in mechanisms to make sure that the data is current and correct. Although Wikipedia is as good as Encyclopedia Britannica, supposedly there's lots of things out there that aren't Wikipedia. Does anybody around the table have any magic bullets, golden bullets, silver bullets, bronze bullets in this area? And is this something that we have hope of addressing? Silence is consent.
Susan Estrada. I probably because I'm coming at this from a very different perspective than most of the people in this room. I sort of look at what we do in our lives as gap fillers, right? So we see these huge problems and say, crap, how do we fix them? So I agree with you that, and I'm going to make this a little bit higher level, that I really see that part of the role that NITRD should be playing is the gap fillers between the agency's missions and perhaps these intractable problems. Veracity is one. Cybersecurity is one. I mean, there's just spam. Who's going to solve these problems, particularly problems that in industry may not have an immediate ROI, right? So an industry research team is not going to attempt to even look at these things because there's no way to find that payoff 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road. Or ever, right? So there's this sort of, I call it the early bird gets the worm versus the second mouse gets the cheese syndrome. So that, the federal agencies have the opportunity to be the early bird and the first mouse. And industry would tend to sort of be the second mouse because they need to have the cheese in order to be successful. Particularly in the environment that we face probably for the next 3 to 5 years in terms of the economic climate, I think industry is going to be even more on the second mouse side of the equation. And it really is imperative that some of these very difficult problems, particularly on the networking side, because that's what I do for a living, need to be really looked at in order for us to have a robust broadband deployment that's actually useful and creates an innovative environment for people to use.
Well, I will just recall a meeting yesterday where someone from Apple was present and pointed out that it was precisely during the downturn after the dot-com bust that they sunk a lot of money into research and came up with the iPod, essentially. So I think wise companies, and there's been a lot of talk about this, do see this as an opportunity. It obviously takes resources to be able to take advantage of the opportunity, but those are the tough decisions that the industries are having to make.
Anybody else for truth?
Well, let me just react quickly to Susan's comment, because I did work on a project on spam control. So industry can do that. But I think that the basic point you're on is right. There's a graph which I was tempted to show, but I figured it had nothing to do with emergent cognition, that somebody made up, which was the half-life of a company in the S&P 500. And the graph kind of goes like this and cycles back, but it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, so that now the half-life of a company staying in the S&P 500 is considerably shorter than it's been at any previous juncture. I mean, modulo the cycle business. And I fear that what that means is that, at least in the U.S., companies will focus more on short-term profits because they don't know that they'll be around. And that's probably what our MBAs are taught. And it's certainly what the stock analysts try to teach our CEOs, that they should focus on the short term. And I think that does imperil the notion of industrial research, and I think that would be a real shame, because I think it is an important part of our cycle, and I do think that we will need help from the government, at least in the near term, in terms of continuing that.
I will then use this. That's a great segue into something which I wasn't going to mention, but now I will. Norm Augustine was on PCAST when I was executive director, and I heard him on more than one occasion relay, and I'm going to try to tell the story that he's told a couple of times, and you may have heard him tell this too, because I think he uses it often. But when he was the chairman of Lockheed Martin, he was very proud of some technological discovery that his research team had made, and he went to a meeting with some Wall Street types and announced this major breakthrough, he thought, in the technology that was really going to help the company. And he said their response was, "You're spending money on research," and the next day the stock at Lockheed Martin went down, and he said it took years for it to recover. And he certainly learned a lesson there, which was, if you're going to invest in research, don't talk about it, and maybe don't even do it. So my question is, what can the government do to change that equation? And one thing is to actually reward companies for investing in research. So there's this tax credit for research and experimentation, or research and development, depending on who's talking about it. It's been around for a while. It's could be fixed, could be made permanent. There's a lot of calls for making it permanent. I find that politically unlikely. But it could be modified or improved to actually even weight more university research. So I think currently companies that invest in internal research get credit. If they invest in university research, they get credit. But they don't get more credit for university research, even though it is likely to be more basic, more public, more widely useful, in a sense. And so my sort of call to Congress, and I think our staffer is still back here, she can share this with her colleagues on other Ways and Means committees or whatever, is to really incentivize industry, since they don't spend as much internal money on basic research, if they ever did, to invest more at universities through consortia, groups, or independently. Maria.
So yet another thing that I don't understand in the United States is why there's not more matching funds for industries investing in university research.
By the government?
By the government, yeah. So, I mean, but particularly by the federal government. I ran a research project on educational games for learning mathematics, for children learning mathematics, for about 10 years. And based on something like $40,000 a year from Electronic Arts, I managed to bring in over 3 years, I managed to get matching funds of somewhere over $500,000. And it was, I mean, it was a small investment by Electronic Arts. It was their first investment in university research in the history of the company, both the U.S. and Canada. And I think the only reason they did it was that it was a small investment, and they could see it was going to bring in significant matching funds. And this was one of these pyramid schemes where they got matched by the provincial government, and then that got matched by the federal government, and that got matched by something else, and so on and so forth.
There was the Advanced Technology Program, and that's morphed into something called the Technology Innovation Program at NIST, and that may have some of those qualities. So look forward to calls.
I couldn't speak, but you could.
Okay. Mark.
Yeah, first I want to possibly correct a misinterpretation. I realized afterwards that somebody might interpret what I was saying as an IBMer. IBM has stayed in the Fortune, the S&P 500 for a lot longer, and I think that that's in part because we do invest in research. I don't want to suggest that we're going to stop that, and I realize somebody might draw that inference from what I said. That is not a correct inference. We do have, but to the point that Maria raised, we do have a program called Open Collaborative Research, where what we do is we fund universities to work on open source with us on a bunch of things. And we found inside the U.S. that funding can get matched a gazillion ways inside inside the U.S. by various government agencies. I don't know that there's a formal program, but you can use the fact that you've gotten that money as a wedge to say this is important, and we can get tremendous amounts of matching for that program.
We have to wrap it up. I think there's opportunities for sort of side conversations. There were some questions about the report that I mentioned earlier, and we'll make sure that the link gets sent out to everybody. But you can find it by Googling on PCAST. It's still up on the OSTP/PCAST website with the title University Private Sector Research Partnerships. So you can find that on the web. And I'll turn it over. Thank you, everybody.
So this was a great first day. I want to thank all the participants. We stayed on time. We had stimulating conversation, and we'll expect to do more tomorrow.